Okay, so for this part we talk about one of the few places that has not gone out of business and has used irrigation, although, as we'll see, it's kind of complicated. So, Egypt. Just as a fun fact, so these things, right, pyramids and the Sphinx, maybe in your mind, at least it was this way for me, you imagine these as being like far off in the middle of the desert somewhere where there's no people. It's not true, actually. In the main city of Egypt, in Cairo, in the capital, you can like see these driving back and forth every day on your way to work. They're really not that isolated at all. And we'll have another reason as to why this is in a minute. So, this is Egypt, right? The Nile River sort of counterintuitively flows from south all the way up to north. This is the famous Nile River Delta. Actually, the reason why those things are called deltas is because somebody looked at this thing and thought that it looked like a Greek letter D, which kind of looks like a triangle. I didn't do it, but that's what it is, right? So you have all these sort of interconnected, flat-lying river systems down here, right? And so you have a ton of awesome farmland all through the river delta, constantly getting sediment and fresh nutrients, constantly getting water. Really, really great place to farm and to kickstart this whole humanity thing, right? Now, the Nile River itself actually flows a long way. It flows through like 10 different countries, and Egypt is just the last one of them. And if you're thinking to yourself, so what the other countries do to the Nile could cut off water to Egypt, hold that thought. This is modern-day Israel up here, right? We talked about the Tigris and Euphrates. Those are off over here, and this is our Arabian Peninsula. And then here is Egypt. And just as a sort of reminder of how important this river is to the people there and to just how Egypt is organized, this is a population density map of the country, right? Most people have no idea. They think that people are like spread out or living in the desert. It's not true. Vast majority of everybody in this entire country of Egypt lives along the Nile River, right? All of these red to orange to blue, purple, and white colors are where all the people are, and basically nobody lives anywhere else out in the desert. It is, in fact, part of their religion, right? Ancient religion. They had Hapi, who is their god of the Nile River specifically, and also of growth and fertility and harvest and all these other good things. Really important to them. From a sort of hydrologic standpoint, right, it is not a youthful river. So this youthful sort of profile, right, and this is like a side view of the river to clarify, right? It's like if you're sitting in your, inner tube floating down the river, what would you see? Well, if you were in the Colorado River, right at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you would see something like this, right? Because that is a very youthful river, as my students would say, straight, high, and young, right? Nile is a mature river, right? Much wider, flatter, curvier, with this huge floodplain, right? A wide channel, not necessarily so deep, not so steep, all the sharp edges have really been rounded off by old age, right? And importantly, you have this massive floodplain on either side of it, right? So whenever there is a rainstorm, right, the river goes from being like this wide to being this wide, which is how the Egyptians used to grow their crops, right? Is you would have all of these farms that relied on the fact that, okay, it is inevitable that there's going to be rain at some point and that the Nile is going to flood at some point. And so you have something that was really different from those other kinds of canal systems and irrigation systems, right? Where they had something that was much more sustainable and has been sustainable for a long time. I mean, thousands of years that people have been doing this, right? You have all these farms and little canals that are right next to the river that don't try to control the water necessarily, right? They're just in the floodplain, and they know it's inevitable that this thing is going to flood up and spread out really wide and bring all these awesome, nutrients and everything that the plants need, and water as well, right? Things worked out this way for a long time, extremely sustainable, awesome. Here's an aerial photo. Now, this is obviously a modern photo. We can see development here, right? But it really gets the point across, right? I mean, of how different the floodplain area is that gets water along the Nile, where all the people live, versus the area that doesn't get the floodplain, right? where there's no people. Huge difference, awesome system, just one more way of looking at it, right? We've got a river, and it's, you know, relatively flat and wide and curvy, right? And notice, right, whenever it floods this entire area of the floodplain, right? So this is where you build your farms, and when it floods, everything gets water and fresh nutrients. And awesome, right? So what's the problem? Well, at a certain point, Egypt wanted to industrialize. So in something like the 50s, they had this incredibly charismatic, strong man president type, is what he was, who decided that he was going to, you know, bring the entire Arab world together and work on this huge project to make a dam, right? The Aswan Dam, right? Which he did. And at the time, it was the biggest construction project in the history of the world, no joke, and they did it, right? So here's a picture of the president. I'll have to put his name in a note, right? And he's launching off construction of this dam, right? And there's, you know, 100 bazillion million people who work on it doing feats of athletics and working 50-hour days, day and night, and making 10 times as much as they could anywhere else, right? And putting in everything that they need to be able to dam up the Nile River right here, right? And there's a number of reasons why this would have been done, right? This would have allowed the country to harness it for electricity, right? So the water that moves through this, which is what it looks like from the top down, right? Water that moves through is losing all this energy, right? It goes from being really high up and falling down, right? And it turns out if you put a wheel in here, then as the water falls under the force of gravity, then it starts to turn that wheel, and you can use that to generate electricity, like a lot of electricity. Enough electricity to essentially help the entire country to industrialize, right? And this had a massive effect, right? Ultimately, even though I believe it was started in like the late 50s, it wasn't completed until the 70s. Reservoir capacity we'll put into context, but this is big, and shout out to PBS for putting all of these materials together for us, right? Here's what the final thing sort of looked like, right? And water, a massive amount of it flows from up here where it's got loss of energy and loses it, turns wheels along the way to generate electricity, right? And as a result of putting this dam in, you can control things, right? In other words, the Nile is no longer subject to, you know, random flooding or uncontrolled flooding events, but is much more under control, right? Much more smoothed out, but with some caveats, right? Oh, and just to put it into perspective, right? So this is the Hoover Dam, which when it was constructed, which was in the 30s, don't quote me on it, was the biggest engineering project in the history of the world, right? And this one was bigger by like a factor of 5. Absolutely colossal thing. Pictures don't really do it justice. And you can also understand if it's got 6 trillion cubic feet of water, why you can generate a butt ton of electricity, right? It allows the entire country to industrialize and do better than ever before. So what's the problem, right? This is a good thing. Okay, well, we'll get into that now. So first, you could control the flow of water, right? And so instead of getting flooding randomly downstream where all the people are, you can somewhat control flooding in certain areas, right? So no more random floods for all the people down near the Nile River, which causes issues. But at the same time, if you stop flooding in one area due to the dam, then sort of behind the dam, if that makes sense, right, south of it, where you've sort of built this big reservoir and held everything up, you make the flooding worse, right? So flooding gets better in some areas, but then it causes flooding to be worse in others. Same way that, you know, if you go to like the beach and you build a big wall to like prevent the tide from coming in, then you make the tide even more intense in other places where you didn't have the wall. Or, you know, if you restrict somebody's arm so that part of it can't move and then make them do stuff, then you actually put a bunch of extra strain on all the rest of it, which biomechanically has to compensate for the fact that part of it has now been restricted, right? So you stop flooding downstream where a lot of the people are, but you increase flooding elsewhere, right? The other part of it is you no longer get all of this silt, right? So the silt is now clogging up in the canals and building up in the reservoir instead of flooding out onto the farmland. And because you don't get this really awesome silt and all these nutrients onto the farmland, then people have to use fertilizers and tons of fertilizers, and the country of Egypt has to take out loans from the World Bank, no kidding, that they never pay back in order to get all this money to fertilize everything, and it leads to these disastrous algal blooms out in the Mediterranean and causes issues for fishing in other countries, right, and geopolitical issues that are related to that, right? So it's sort of hard to reconcile these things, right? On the one hand, we notice that, as Egypt industrializes, right, and modernizes, it becomes so much better for the people there. As seen by our drop in child mortality, right, death rates begin to fall as our first step of industrialization and transition to a modernized state. But what about the other countries, right? So it's a little bit tough maybe to see on this map, right? But like the Nile River is where my cursor is, right? And it comes up here, it flows, well, it actually flows this way, right? So legally speaking, Egypt has the rights to the Nile River, and Sudan has the rights to the Nile River. And Sudan has been in the midst of a civil war, a really horrible one. It's actually split into two countries, right? And has been for like 40 years. One of the most war-torn places on Earth. Not good. But what about all these other countries like Ethiopia, right? Which has some 100 million people. Legally speaking, they were not given any access to the Nile River. But what if they just started to build a dam themselves, right? What if they tried to do the exact same thing that Egypt did with the Nile River, right? Egypt was able to use the Nile to industrialize, but we're going to say that these other countries, right, which have just as many people as Egypt, or actually Ethiopia has more people than Egypt, we're going to say that they're too far upstream and legally just, give them the finger? Well, you can see how this could be a recipe for conflict, right? Ethiopia intending to build a dam on the Nile River would restrict flow of its water and would, technically speaking, be illegal, not that that would stop them from doing it, and combined with the fact that there is a civil war going on here, and the fact that Egypt itself is in a precarious position, and we can see the recipe for geopolitical disaster, right? Yeah, just another way of viewing it, right? So here's our Aswan High Dam in Egypt. Sudan's building one. These other countries building dams as well. Could very easily lead to conflict, which could easily spill over. This is from the Camp David Accords back in the 70s, where Israel made peace with Egypt, right? Despite the fact that the vast majority of people in Egypt do not like Israel, is the easy way to put it. Something like 80 or 90% of them do not have a favorable view. So then this peace kind of comes entirely from bureaucratic ingot from the top down. It means it's very fragile, right? Back in the Arab Spring, something like 10 to 15 years ago, right, there was a overthrow of the government in Egypt and all sorts of civil strife as a result. And as a long story short, the political situation there is precarious. And the fact that it is right next to another unfolding situation, right, here in Israel, and here's Gaza, right, and here's Rafah, means that we've gone about as far as I can take you. Things could get a lot worse. That's going to complete our story on Egypt for now, because it brings us back to literally right here and now in 2024. Next, we'll go back in time a little bit and talk about the American West and water there.